In this video, we're going to start looking at how named ranges can be used to automate functionality in workbooks, and this is actually the most important reason for using them. The example we're going to look at is how we can automate data validation, but that's just one of many examples. Now, just before we get started, we're going to create one last named range, so good practice. We want to name the locations named range, and the quickest way to do this is using our create from selection. So I'm going to select from A7 down to A9, and keyboard shortcut, you may remember, is Control-Shift-F3. Top row is what I want, so I'm just going to press Enter. And if I double check my name box, there's my locations, and it's my two cities. Right, let's come back into our invoice report. Zara has added conditional formatting so that if I come into K2 and type Sydney, it automatically highlights all the Sydney rows. And of course, the same happens for Melbourne. Now, we're going to look at conditional formatting a lot more in the next course. But what we're going to focus on is Zara's problem, which is she doesn't want to have to type it in. She would like a drop-down list where she can select Sydney or Melbourne. Now, to do this, we use something called data validation. I'm just going to delete that for a moment. With K2 selected, we're going to come to our Data tab, and we're going to click Data Validation. Data validation allows us to control what users input into a cell, so we can specify that a number must be within a certain range, for example. It also allows us to create drop-down lists, and to do this, we change the any value to list. In the source box, we need to specify what we see in that list, and we could just type values, but then we would have to come and manually change it every time there was a change, and that we don't want. So we're going to use a named range instead. You can type the name of the range, or even better, you can come to your Formulas tab, click Use in Formula, and choose Locations. The keyboard shortcut for this is F3. Now we're going to click OK. A drop-down has appeared, and if I click on that drop-down, I can choose Sydney or Melbourne. So that's half of it done. We've created our data validation, and we've linked it to a named range. But we would like that named range to automatically grow. So back in my recon analysis, if I add another region, I want it to appear in my drop-down list. So I have to have a way of somehow making my named ranges more dynamic. And we can do this using a calculation. The calculation has two parts. The first part is to work out how many values we actually have, and that's quite straightforward. I'll demonstrate in this cell over here. So if I type equals COU, I want to count, but I'm not counting numbers, so I have to actually use the COUNTA function, which is count alphanumerics. So I'm going to double-click COUNTA, and then assuming I'll never have more than 10 regions, I'm going to select A8 down to A18 and press Enter, and that's telling me there are 2. If I added another region, you can see it picks up 3. I'll undo that for now. So that's the first part. But the named range actually needs the actual values. And to do that, we're going to need to use a slightly trickier function called the offset function. What the offset does is, given a starting point, it will return a block of data a certain number of rows or columns away from that starting point. Let's go build the whole thing in the name manager. So back into my name manager, I'm going to come to Locations, and I'm going to click Edit. And I'm going to replace this hard-coded named range with something that is calculated. I'm going to remove all of that, and I'm going to use the offset function to do this. So I'm going to type offset and open my brackets. Now it has to have a starting point, and that is our first location. So I'm going to click on A8 and then type a comma. Then it wants to know how many rows away from that starting point we want to begin. And that's 0 because we're starting there. Then a comma. Next, it wants to know how many columns away we want to start, and again, that is 0. And then another comma, and here is where we specify how many rows we want to include in our range, and we do this with our count A. So again, count A and select A8 down to A18. Close our brackets for our count A, close our brackets for our offset. And now you can press OK and close. Let's go check that our named range is still working. So we're going to click the drop down and you can see it's still Sydney and Melbourne. But if I now come back into my recon analysis and add Perth, when I check my drop down this time, Perth has been added. So what we've seen is how our data validation has automatically updated by using something called a dynamic named range. And for a long time, this was the only way we could do this. But that calculation is a little bit tricky, so I have some great news for you. Next week, we're going to look at a feature called tables, which adds all this automation for us without actually having to create that scary offset function. For this week, though, you've done really well.